Hello, this is America, friend to many Gulf nations, but for how long? See, Iranian missiles are not landing here in the United States. They're hitting countries like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, nations that have traditionally had beneficial relations with Washington. So can this Western superpower continue to protect them? And if it can't, what does that mean for their future? We're going to be looking at that in more detail shortly. But first, Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Phil. In a moment, we'll look at how America's role as an ally is impacting those deep ties with Gulf nations, because the war again escalated overnight. And while the US is claiming to have no prior knowledge of Israel's attacks on Iran's gas fields, Donald Trump says he told Benjamin Netanyahu not to go ahead.
I told him don't do that, and he won't do that. We didn't discuss. We're independent, we get along great. It's coordinated, but on occasion he'll do something, and if I don't like it, and so we're not doing that anymore.
Too little, too late. Because Iran's retaliation on its neighbours has left Gulf states worried they're being left dangerously exposed, geographically, politically and economically. It was only 6 months ago the US president said an attack on Qatar would be treated as a threat to the peace and security of the US. So, where is America now? Because Gulf states have spent years and years and trillions of dollars investing in relationships with the USA. Now, events unfolding have left some wondering if this is the beginning of a new regional order. Osama bin Javaid has this report.
UAE is like the banker for Iran. They're like the banker. Qatar, their neighbors, they got along okay. Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden, Kuwait is getting hit. Bahrain is getting, all these countries are getting hit. There was no expert that would say that was going to happen. It's not a question of like, gee, should you have known? And if we did know, big deal. I mean, we have to do what we have to do.
That indifference has shaken trust and confidence. A phrase that's being repeated across the Gulf in Majlis gatherings and social media. Those who rely on America for protection wake up exposed. As the US-Israel war with Iran escalates, the Gulf is confronting a difficult question. Has the United States failed to protect its closest allies? The relationship was built on a clear understanding. The United States would provide security, the Gulf would provide stability, energy, investment, and strategic access. Missiles and drones have struck targets across the region. Oil infrastructure and shipping lanes are under threat, and yet the response from Washington has been muted. Saudi analysts warn the war risks pulling Gulf states into a dangerous confrontation without clear long-term support from Washington. In Doha, the contradiction is especially stark. Qatar hosts one of the largest US military presence in the region. It has invested heavily in the American economy, and it has played a central diplomatic role from Afghanistan to Gaza. But in this conflict, proximity to US power has also meant exposure. There's a concern that American defense is focused on Israel and not on Arab Gulf states, which are home to most military bases. Analysts across the region are beginning to question whether hosting foreign forces is still a guarantee of security or increasingly a liability. The debate is no longer behind closed doors. It's playing out publicly between some of the Arab world's most recognizable voices. Influential Emirati businessman Khalaf al-Habtoor, who said Gulf states must trust their own capabilities rather than alliances whose interests don't align with theirs. At the heart of this crisis is a hard reality: geography. Iran is leveraging proximity, its position along the Strait of Hormuz, its missiles reach across the Gulf, and its ability to target critical infrastructure. After years of Gulf diplomacy, rapprochement with Tehran meant Saudi Chief of General Staff visited Tehran in November 2024. Despite mediation efforts led by Qatar and Oman and de-escalation attempts by Saudi Arabia, the region has still been pulled into the conflict. Now, quietly, Gulf states are reassessing everything. There is no dramatic break with Washington, but there is a shift towards diversification and strategic autonomy, and towards new partnerships, perhaps with China or with Europe. So far, the balancing act is to deter Iran without provoking it, while coordinating with the US but resisting being drawn into its wars. The question echoing across the region is no longer just about the failure and lack of trust. It is far more consequential. Can the Gulf still rely on the American shield around which it built its future? Osama bin Javaid, Al Jazeera.
As we mentioned, American allies came under bombardment again on Wednesday, not for the first time, as Iran targets those countries with US relationships. Phil's back in the newsroom with a look at how it's being reflected in the media.
Yeah, these attacks are getting coverage, but the real focus is on the relationship between the United States and those Gulf nations, what it looks like now, what it looks like going forward. So let's start with foreign policy. The stark headline there, the United States could lose the Gulf. And it goes on to add, Iran's attacks on its neighbours are a reminder that the United States cannot protect them. Remember, some of these countries are being hit on a daily or almost daily basis. So it continues, even as they are forced to openly cooperate with Israel in its war, they will increasingly view it as a threat rather than a potential ally. Right up next, it is Tucker Carlson, former Fox News host, still a very prominent voice in the conservative podcast space. He says this is all about Israel deliberately trying to harm those Gulf nations.
And so the Israelis knew, and the Americans knew as well, maybe not quite as realistic an assessment, but they had some sense. The Israelis definitely knew that if you start lobbing missiles into Iran, and if you start killing the leadership of Iran, if you were to do that, it would provoke a military response that would hurt the Gulf badly.
Right, next, it is CNN here in the United States. And its headline here, why Trump's Gulf allies are resisting pressure to join the Iran war. And its analyst makes the point that you cannot change geography. Iran is always going to be there. Here's what they say. American forces will eventually pack up and leave the Middle East while Iran remains a permanent neighbor. They, as in the United States, have left Afghanistan. Right, up next we have CNBC. The headline there, Gulf caught in the crossfire. GCC to rethink relations with both Iran and the US, says strategist. And their strategist makes the point that despite the fact that these countries are being hit, there doesn't appear to be the appetite or the enthusiasm to hit back in the same way. Take a listen.
Yeah, I think it's been quite clear that the US and even Israel have been trying to push the Gulf states into fully and formally joining this war. And I think the Gulf states have been restrained for a number of reasons.
Next up to the Wall Street Journal, the headline there, Gulf states want the US to cripple Iran's regime before ending the war. And it goes on to say, in pivot for region that had courted Tehran, Gulf leaders now insist that Iran must be rendered incapable of future attacks. And finally, we have a podcast from Foreign Affairs, which makes the point that despite what happens in the future, these Gulf nations may actually not have much of a say at all. Take a listen.
You could see a scenario where the president decides this is not worth it and he wants to exit this conflict. And I think you're actually left with a really interesting problem where the president wants out of this conflict, the Gulf wants out of this conflict, but Iran and Israel might not want to.
This is a war involving more than 3 countries. It is a war involving multiple US allies. They've been brought into this, whether they like it or not.
Well, Gulf states have invested billions of dollars in the US, opened up their military bases, shared intelligence, and now they're being left wholly exposed to this conflict because of the actions of the US and Israel. So where does this leave the future of the relationship between America and its Arab allies? To discuss, we're joined by former CIA official Norman Rule and former US ambassador to Bahrain, Adam Early. Thank you both for joining me. Norman, was it a mistake for Gulf nations to open up their military bases to America?
Well, I would dispute your approach to this because it's true Gulf nations have invested billions of dollars, opened up their countries, and have shared information with us. Let me turn that around a bit. The United States has invested billions of dollars, has risked the lives of hundreds of thousands of its personnel over decades, has shared vast amounts of intelligence which dwarfs anything available anywhere else in the world, and has done so because of a malign nation that every Gulf nation agrees is a threat to the security of every one of its citizens, very far away from American shores, and has done so throughout multiple administrations. Now, the United States is not there because it is attempting to invade Iran. It is there because Iran has threatened every Gulf nation many times over the years. So I don't think it's a mistake that the Gulf nations have turned to the United States for support, and the United States has consistently been there when the United States has been needed.
I guess the issue that has become the pinhead on which we're all turning here is the nature or the pressing nature of that threat. How much was it an immediate threat when we look now at the actions that Iran is taking? And I'm wondering then, Adam, if I can bring you in, what that means to the relationship between America and these nations. Is it in tatters yet? Is there any salvaging the relationship that they have?
I don't think they're relationships that need salvaging, to be honest. I mean, the leaders of the Gulf are smart people, right? They know how to assess risk, and they know how to plan long term. And I think that their assessment is weighing who's in the neighborhood, weighing what we have, weighing what we need. Our best partner is the United States. Over the long term, in economic terms, political terms, security terms. However, it's not an exclusive relationship, right? So, the United States is a great ally, but they're not always as dependable as we'd like, right? So we're going to hedge our bets. We're going to, invest in other partners just in order to be as safe and secure as possible. What we're learning now is, I think, a couple of things. Number one, it's one thing to start a war, it's another thing to finish it.
Yeah.
And number two, no defense shield is impermeable, right? I mean, there's no such thing as cost-free war. You can minimize the cost. You can install protective measures, which exist and which are working fabulously, I might add. But that doesn't mean it's cost-free.
And the cost we are seeing is going to those Gulf nations, Norman. And I wonder at what point that cost is too high for them, because Qatar relies on LNG as its source of income, exporting that. And as we have seen, its facility is badly damaged. It will take years to revive that and get it back up and running. That's an enormous cost to a country such as Qatar.
Absolutely. And had Qatar not invested in security and intelligence and defenses over the years, Iran would have certainly overtaken that years and years ago, and done the same over Bahrain, and a government it attempted to overthrow on at least 3 occasions, and Gulf states where it has sent dozens of terrorist operatives on multiple occasions over the years, going back to the 1980s.
Should Qatar have expected more then from the US, can I be more blunt about it? Should they have expected more defensive capability or more protection from the US in the event that they decided they needed, as you say, to take this action against Iran? Surely they had foreseen that Iran would retaliate. Should Gulf states not have expected more assistance in providing defence to their infrastructure and to their strategic assets?
Well, let's take that apart. What does that actually mean? We have sent aircraft carrier task forces. We have sent our finest defensive technology, which has enabled the Gulf states to defend themselves on day one of the most profound air defense threat any set of countries have faced in the modern history, and performed spectacularly, to include on cyber threats, which have received little notice in the press. They have received technology, are training, they have performed wonderfully. It's not perfect, but I think they've done very well.
All right. Adam?
When you talk about defense matters and when you talk about security, it's an incredibly complex topic with a lot of different systems.
Absolutely.
I would underscore what Norman said is, everybody focuses on the guys that got through, the hits on Ras Laffan, the hits on airports and that sort of stuff. What they don't focus on is 95% of the ballistic missiles that were shot against these guys were intercepted by Patriot batteries that they bought and that they operate. So what we're seeing is American defense capability that has been shared with and worked together with our Arab and Gulf allies is working. But what it also shows us is, if you fight Iran, you're gonna pay a price. So the question is, should we fight Iran?
Yeah, so I guess
that's not a question, and that's a question that, frankly, Iran answered a long time ago.
What I'm hearing is you're both saying it actually just could have been worse as the other scenario, not that it could have been any better. Norman, you have friends in high places, might be a way of putting it. What are you hearing from inside the administration on their feelings about the relationships that they have with the likes of UAE, Qatar, Kuwait?
They're in frequent contact with the senior-most leadership of all of these countries on almost a daily basis, military, security, and political levels. I'm not hearing of any air gaps between them. The Omani government has made it clear that they have a different view on how this war should be conducted, and they have a role they wish to play in terms of being an intermediary. They've been open about this. I think that's a little different than how the other Gulf states view it. But again, there's a candor there that I think is only allowed because we have that honesty in the relationships. But again, the United States is meeting with Omani and GCC officials in our foreign relations committees of the Congress on a daily basis. So the relationship is quite open and dynamic on a daily basis.
Adam, you're a man who spent a lot of time in the area. Can I ask you, these are countries with enormous expatriate populations built around the idea of security and safety and stability. How damaging, or is this damaging, this conflict, to that perception of these places as a safe haven for expatriates wanting to work and live in the UAE, or the Middle East rather?
You know, it depends. It's interesting.
I mean, it's not a good look.
It's not a good look. Look, the British expats live in the Gulf because they don't pay they don't have to pay taxes. So it's financially attractive to them. There aren't that many Americans, and Americans tend to generally be gun shy, right? But I just think that over the last, 15 or 20 years, we've seen periodic bouts of violence in this part of the world. Whether it was 1990 in Kuwait, whether it was 2003, and Americans were advised to leave. These are things that happen, then they blow over, then things go back to normal. My question is, what is the new normal after this is over?
Yeah.
Is it going to be what it was before? I don't think so, because it has reached a level of violence that nobody's seen. Nobody has ever seen metropolitan areas, Manama, Doha, Dubai, apartment buildings, hotels, and ports hit. And the interesting thing that we haven't talked about is the defensive systems that have been implemented have worked largely, but they haven't been against drones. It's the drones that are doing so much damage. And it's like, the question I have is like, how come we didn't protect against drones?
Okay.
But that's something we didn't foresee. I don't know why.
Well, let's talk about it in a moment. Priority number one seems to be for the Gulf states appearing to be pleading for peace, of course, and a chance at diplomacy. Here's Qatar's Prime Minister, Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani.
These Iranian attacks, unfortunately, have done nothing except shaken stability and security in the region. The region's countries met yesterday and refused collectively the aggression and urged Iran to stop the aggression and the attacks. Diplomacy is always there, dialogue is always there.
Norman, Qatar's Prime Minister saying that this was a war against the stability of the region. So how do Gulf nations convince the US, if that's who they're supposed to be convincing, to pull back from this conflict and to get everyone back around the table?
Well, the United States has been clear that it seeks certain things from Iran. Iran cannot have a program where it can have the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. It cannot have a missile program where it is building a program that it will threaten its neighbors. This is a country that writes death to Israel on its missiles. No other sane country does this in the world.
Sure, but Gulf states are not negotiating with Iran.
No,
They're trying to talk
I've
to the
got
US.
it, but the United States has broader interests. If you're asking the United States what it does to come to the table, it's got to have its interests taken care of. And last, the Quds Force, which operates against the entire region with missiles and drones that have attacked the Gulf states repeatedly, must be constrained. And the United States has said to Iran, if you constrain those three elements, we'll lift sanctions. And Iran has refused.
So we are wedging all of this on waiting for Iran to get to that point, or reliant on the US or this conflict continuing and potentially continuing to escalate until that point?
At this point, it appears that that's where we are.
Adam, how do you feel about that?
Well, for me, it's like deja vu, right? Because I was in Iraq in 2010 and 2006, right? And we overthrew Saddam Hussein. We were going to be welcomed with flowers and all that sort of stuff. I think the United States is much better at waging war than it is at building peace. At least that's my experience in the Middle East.
Okay.
I don't disagree at all with Norm that Iran is a clear and present danger. They've demonstrated it time and again. And the leaders of the Gulf has said time and time again, just if you're going to do it right, do it quickly, and get it over with.
Because are they concerned about being dragged into even
the
further
longer
than
this
they
goes
are?
on, the more of a price they pay, right? The question is, does the United States have the will to see this through?
It is, of course, not just a price that they are saying they will pay. Saudi's foreign minister had this to say last night. Let's take a listen.
The kingdom, but also its partners who have been attacked and beyond, have very significant capacities and capabilities that they could bring to bear should they choose to do so. And the patience that is being exhibited is not unlimited.
Norman, do these Gulf nations have the ability, technically speaking, to respond unilaterally to that threat from Iran?
Certainly, they have powerful air forces. They have powerful military capabilities, but I think they've shown considerable patience and restraint. And I think their primary job should be to defend themselves, do what they can in terms of diplomacy, maintain their civilian populations, and try not to expand this conflict. I think that's very reasonable. But at the same time, they must protect their sovereignty and make their own decisions for their people. And however those decisions work out, it's not, I think, for the United States to say, because again, they're defining the future for their own people.
Adam, we may have covered the edges of this question already, but I'm wondering, and I think Norman has discussed this briefly, when we look at that military presence that America has in these Gulf nations and the way that that is tangibly presented at the moment, do you see that relationship changing or that presence changing beyond what happens after this conflict?
Hard to imagine it changing dramatically. I mean, there might be more different force protection measures taken, but I don't see Qatar or Bahrain or Kuwait or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, for that matter, saying, you know what, thanks but no thanks, bye-bye. For a couple of reasons. First of all, there's been so much invested in it already. Second of all, getting back to my earlier point about risk assessment, are you better off with them or without them? I think any full analysis would come to the conclusion that you're better off with them.
Are there alternatives, though?
And then the final point is, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? You're damned if you do because there really are no alternatives.
Are there not, Norman, alternatives regionally? Would this not perhaps open up the chance to discuss alliances or partnerships with other states like Russia or China?
Well, Russia has provided Iran with intelligence on how to target its missiles against the GCC. Russia has provided Iran with enhancements to the Shahed 136 drones to make them more lethal and accurate that are being used against GCC civilian targets. How about that as a partner? China has provided Iran with the chemical precursors for every missile that hit Qatar's gas fields and every target in the GCC. Qatar, which was supposed to constrain Iran as part of the Saudi-Iranian deal, has done exactly what? Now, how about that as a partner for the military? I mean, what exactly are you asking? And now, let me just continue for one moment. And the Europeans, who derive much from the Strait of Hormuz, it is an international body of water. It is not an American waterway, nor an Iranian, nor the Musandam Peninsula Omani waterway. That waterway is something the world should defend. So where is the European Navy at present?
Do you feel, and forgive me for perhaps taking an inference here, that the US has done more of its heavy lifting than it should be doing at this point in the conflict?
No, I'm just pointing out that this is an international responsibility for the Strait of Hormuz.
But
and I'm just asking the question.
The rest of the world didn't start this conflict.
But I think the point Norm is making, which I think is worth reinforcing, is if you're a Gulf state and you're saying, what's my alternative to the United States? Because that's the way we started, about basic.
Sure.
Can I diversify my defense, right? Instead of my economy, can I diversify my defense? Well, what are your choices? Russia's not a choice. China's not a choice. Europe is not a choice because, as Norm points out, they're not even willing to defend their own interests in the region.
What choice then is America if it gets involved in these sorts of conflicts, which there was not...
An uncomfortable one, an imperfect one. But the point is, there is no perfect scenario.
And
when you're next to an actor like Iran.
And to pull back, America could have been involved in a conflict when they attacked Khobar in the 1990s, when the Iranians killed hundreds of Americans in Iraq under George Bush, when the Iranians kidnapped our personnel. There have been multiple attempts under different presidents when the Iranians could have provoked a war, and a conflict did not occur. So it should not be when America gets involved in these sorts of conflicts. This is the first time there was a war between America and Iran in how many years since 1979? So I think it's very important that this not be perceived or characterized as America gets involved in all of these conflicts.
Okay. Before we go, and I'm sorry to have left this one right until the very end, actually, but seems to be some communication, publicly at least, disparity between what America is saying is happening and what Israel is saying is happening, and the perception of who has control at this point. So who is paying the price then of this conflict and that relationship and that disassociation between the two parties?
It's not a perfect partnership. It's interesting to me. The barometer I used, or the thermometer I used to measure the temperature on this question, is domestic U.S. politics. In the sense of, look, the United States and Israel have always seen eye to eye on pretty much everything, right? I think what we're seeing in these events is some of the cracks in that common vision. And you hear it in the different explanations coming out of Tel Aviv and coming out of Washington about the South Pars bombing and this and this and this. But the point is...
Adam, I'm so sorry. I will have to finish there, and I really appreciate you both coming in. I'm sorry we ran out of time. Adam Early, former ambassador to Bahrain. Norman Rule, former CIA official. Thank you both. Well, the fallout from those latest attacks in the Gulf have also been at the centre of debate online across the United States. Here's Alex Baird.
Well, after that Iranian attack on the world's largest LNG hub in Qatar, this post from Trump dragged across socials. The president maintaining the US knew nothing about Israel's attack on Iran's gas field, which led to its retaliatory strikes, and then promising to massively blow up the remainder of Iran's gas field if it attacks Qatar again. Across the US political spectrum, jaws dropped, saying that was a gobsmacking sequence, embarrassing, incompetent, and insane. Former US Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, saying there is zero chance the IDF would have carried out its attack without telling the states. Ex-users also honing in on this moment earlier in the week from Trump.
So they hit Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait. Nobody expected that. We were shocked.
The response to that? Pretty uniform, that despite Trump saying he was shocked, every expert said this was likely to happen. But outside all of this, the US ambassador to the UN reminding Americans that the Gulf is now living this painful reality. And this video doing the rounds online, in which Iran promises further destruction if attacks continue, goes to show that pain could be far from over.
Well, that's all for now from Washington, D.C. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US and influence the world.